My name is Robert Rob Sullivan. I'm 43 years old, and I'm a professional dog musher who has dedicated my entire adult life to the sport of long-distance sled dog racing. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, please. I've been running sled dogs in Alaska for 20 years, ever since I moved here from Minnesota, after college, specifically to pursue this passion. I compete in long-distance races throughout the winter season, including the Iditarod, which is without question the world's most famous and grueling dog sled race. The Iditarod runs over 1,000 miles from Anchorage to Nome, crossing some of the most remote, unforgiving, and brutal terrain in North America. Mushers and their dog teams face extreme cold that can drop to -50 or colder, whiteout blizzards that reduce visibility to zero, dangerous river ice crossings where one mistake means drowning in frozen water, and complete isolation for days at a time with no possibility of rescue if something goes wrong. The race typically takes between 8 and 15 days, depending on weather conditions and the musher's experience level. I've completed the Iditarod 7 times over my career, and I know the trail, its dangers, and its moods better than most people who run it. This particular incident happened during last year's race in early March. I was running a team of 14 dogs, all of them experienced racing animals I'd trained myself over several years, dogs I trusted completely with my life. We were 5 days into the race, approximately 600 miles approaching the checkpoint at Ruby, a small native village on the Yukon River. This section of the trail is notorious for being remote and unforgiving, running through wilderness that's hours away from any village, road, or possibility of help. If something goes wrong out here, you're on your own until you can reach the next checkpoint or another musher catches up to you. The weather conditions that night were actually pretty typical for early March on the trail. Temperatures hovering around -20 Fahrenheit, light snow falling intermittently, and moderate wind that wasn't strong enough to create dangerous conditions. These were actually good running conditions by Iditarod standards. I was traveling at night, which is completely normal and actually preferred during the race. Dogs run better and faster in cooler temperatures, and the trail is often harder and faster when it's frozen solid overnight rather than softened by any daytime sun. My headlamp illuminated maybe 50 feet ahead of me, showing the reflective trail markers that guide mushers and the rhythmic motion of my dogs' backs as they ran in their practiced formation. Everything was completely routine and normal. The team was running well, maintaining a good steady pace without being pushed too hard, responsive to my voice commands. Then, without any warning or command from me, the lead dogs stopped abruptly in their tracks. In dog mushing, when your lead dogs stop without being commanded to stop, something is definitely wrong. Either they've spotted an obstacle on the trail ahead, like a moose or overflow ice. They're completely exhausted and physically can't continue, or there's something ahead that genuinely concerns them enough to refuse to proceed. I called out the standard commands to get them moving again, but they refused completely, which is extremely unusual with well-trained leaders who've run the Iditarod before. I set my snow hook firmly, the metal anchor that digs into the snow and holds the sled in place, and walked up the line to the front of the team to see what was causing the problem. All 14 dogs were completely focused on something off the trail, about 20 yards into the tree line. Every single dog was staring at exactly the same spot, their ears forward in alert position, their bodies tense and rigid. Several of the dogs were growling low in their throats, a sound they usually only make when encountering something they perceive as a serious threat, like a bear or aggressive moose. I shined my headlamp in the direction they were staring and immediately saw tracks in the snow, clearly visible in the beam of my light. They were large tracks, significantly bigger than any wolf track I'd ever seen, and I've seen plenty. They were roughly circular in shape, maybe 18 inches across at their widest point, with no distinct paw pad pattern that would identify them as belonging to any species I recognized. And they were pressed deep into the snow, suggesting that whatever made them was extremely heavy, far heavier than even the largest wolf or wolverine. The tracks emerged from the forest on one side of the trail, crossed directly over the packed trail surface where we'd been about to run, and disappeared back into the forest. They were extremely fresh, made within the last hour, at most based on the clean, sharp edges and the complete lack of any wind fill or new snow accumulation. Whatever had made these tracks had crossed the trail very recently, probably within minutes of our arrival, possibly even watching us approach. I've spent 2 decades in Alaska's wilderness. I've seen bear tracks of every size, moose tracks, wolf tracks, wolverine tracks, lynx tracks. I know the wildlife, and I know how to identify their signs. These tracks didn't match anything I knew or had ever seen. The spacing between individual tracks suggested something walking on 2 legs rather than 4, moving in a bipedal gait. The stride length was enormous, maybe 6 or 7 feet between prints, far longer than any human could manage. And the depth of the impressions suggested something weighing several hundred pounds at minimum, pressing down with enough force to compress the snow significantly. I tried multiple times to get the dogs moving again, using every command and technique I knew, but they absolutely refused to proceed forward. Sled dogs are incredibly tough animals, bred and trained for harsh conditions, not easily frightened by much of anything. These were experienced racing dogs who'd encountered moose, bears, and every weather condition Alaska could throw at them. But my entire team was genuinely terrified, some backing up in their harnesses trying to go the opposite direction, others whining with stress, several lying down in the snow in submission posture as if confronted by a dominant predator. In 20 years of mushing, I had never seen my dogs react this way to anything. Then I heard something moving in the forest. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through snow and breaking small branches, moving parallel to the trail, keeping exact pace with our position. The sounds weren't trying to be quiet or stealthy, weren't moving quickly or aggressively, just walking steadily through the trees, maybe 30 yards out, beyond my headlamp's range. I couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond my limited circle of light, but I could hear it clearly and precisely. And I could smell something carried on the light breeze, a strong and distinctly unpleasant odor, like wet animal fur mixed with rotting meat, a smell that made my stomach turn. I made a quick decision based on my dog's reaction and my own growing unease. I pulled up the snow hook, turned the entire team around on the narrow trail, and headed back the way we'd come at a faster pace than I'd normally run. In a race like the Iditarod, Backtracking costs valuable time and position in the standings. But I trusted my dog's instincts absolutely. They'd never led me wrong before. If they were this frightened and refused to proceed, there was a damn good reason for it. I ran the team at close to full speed back down the trail for approximately 5 miles, putting significant distance between us and whatever had crossed the trail and was moving through the forest. When we were far enough away that the dogs began to relax and return to normal behavior, I was able to navigate onto a parallel trail that I knew would eventually reconnect with the main race route and get us to Ruby Checkpoint. We lost approximately 3 hours, and I dropped from 12th place to 20th in the standings, a significant setback in a competitive race, but we made it safely to the checkpoint with all dogs healthy and uninjured. I reported the incident in detail to race officials at the Ruby Checkpoint. They listened to my account and then told me, somewhat reluctantly, that other mushers had reported very similar experiences over the years in that particular section of trail. Strange tracks that didn't match known animals. Dogs refusing to proceed for no apparent reason. Sounds of something large moving through the forest. One musher in the 1990s had reported being followed for several hours by something he never saw clearly, but could hear pacing him through the trees. Another musher, a few years ago, claimed to have seen something large and bipedal watching him from the tree line. But when he reported it publicly, he was ridiculed by media and other mushers, so he stopped discussing details. The Iditarod Trail passes through the traditional territories of several Alaska Native peoples, including various Athabascan groups who have lived in interior Alaska for thousands of years, long before any Europeans arrived. I talked to some respected elders in Ruby Village about what I'd experienced. They weren't surprised at all by my story and didn't seem to doubt any detail. They told me about creatures from their traditional knowledge called the Nantinak, a word that translates roughly to one who walks alone, or the tracker. According to their accounts passed down through many generations, the Nantinak is a large bipedal creature covered in dark hair that lives in the most remote forests and mountains, and occasionally reveals itself to travelers who venture into its territory. They describe it as territorial and intelligent, not appreciating humans passing through certain areas it considers its own, especially during nighttime hours when it's most active. I've been running sled dogs in Alaska's wilderness for 2 decades now. I've personally encountered grizzly bears, aggressive bull moose, wolf packs, extreme weather including minus 60 temperatures, thin river ice that nearly killed me and my team, and every danger this harsh environment can present. But what happened on that section of trail was fundamentally different from any wildlife encounter I'd had. The way my experienced dogs reacted with genuine terror, the tracks I saw that matched no known animal, the sounds of something large deliberately pacing us through the forest, the horrible smell, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched and evaluated by something intelligent. It wasn't a bear, or wolf, or any animal that appears in field guides. I finished that particular Iditarod in 18th place, which was my worst finish in 7 attempts at the race. But I finished alive, and with all 14 of my dogs completely safe and healthy, which is what actually matters. Some mushers who've reported similar encounters on remote sections of the trail haven't been as fortunate. In 2004, an experienced musher disappeared between checkpoints on that same section of trail I'd backtracked from. His sled and dog team were found abandoned on the trail in perfect condition, dogs healthy and supplies intact. But the musher himself vanished completely and was never seen again, despite extensive search efforts. Search teams found tracks in the snow leading away from the abandoned sled into the forest. But they weren't his boot prints. They were large, circular tracks, very similar to what I'd seen. The Iditarod continues every year, with mushers from around the world racing through some of the most remote and unforgiving wilderness on Earth. Most participants complete the race without any unusual incidents beyond the expected challenges of weather, trail conditions, and physical exhaustion. But there are certain sections of that 1,000-mile trail where experienced mushers travel with extra caution, where dogs sometimes refuse to proceed despite all training, where things that shouldn't exist, according to mainstream science, have been witnessed by multiple reliable and credible witnesses over many decades. Alaska is incomprehensibly vast and mostly empty of human presence. There are enormous areas where humans rarely or never go. Forests and mountain ranges where the only tracks in the snow are from animals. Regions so remote that airplane crashes aren't discovered for decades. It's exactly the kind of place where large, intelligent animals could exist completely undetected by scientific study, especially if they're intelligent enough to deliberately avoid sustained contact with humans. The indigenous peoples who've lived here for thousands of years have always known this. They have specific names for these creatures in their languages, detailed stories and accounts passed down for generations, and protocols for how to behave when traveling through certain areas where these beings are known to live. They don't need or seek scientific proof because they trust their ancestors' accumulated knowledge and their own direct experiences. I still compete in long-distance sled dog races, and I still love the sport of mushing with absolute passion. But I'm more careful and thoughtful now about traveling alone through remote areas, especially during the dark hours. I trust my dog's instincts absolutely and without question. And when I see tracks in the snow that don't match anything I recognize from 2 decades of wilderness experience, I don't investigate out of curiosity. I turn around and find an alternate route. The wilderness keeps its secrets deliberately and for good reasons. And some of those secrets are kept because they're genuinely dangerous for humans to uncover or confront. Story 2. My name is Jennifer Russo. I'm 36 years old, and I make my living as a commercial fisherman based out of the town of Kodiak on Kodiak Island, Alaska. I've worked the rich fishing waters around Kodiak Island for 12 years now, fishing commercially for salmon during their runs, halibut in the deeper waters, and various crab species during their seasons. Kodiak Island is world famous for its bears, being home to the Kodiak brown bear, which is one of the largest bear subspecies in the entire world. Adult male Kodiak bears can weigh well over 1,500 pounds and stand over every single person who lives or works on Kodiak Island year-round, is constantly aware of the bears and takes serious precautions. Bear encounters are relatively common, but usually non-aggressive if you understand bear behavior and follow proper safety protocols like making noise, storing food properly, and giving them space. This particular incident happened last August during the peak of the salmon spawning season, when the fish return to streams to reproduce. I was camping alone at a remote fishing site on the rugged southwest coast of Kodiak Island, a location accessible only by boat with no roads anywhere nearby. I'd been there for 3 days, fishing productively during daylight hours and camping on the beach at night. It's a particularly productive area that I'd fished before, and I was having excellent catches, so I'd planned to stay for a full week before returning to town to sell my catch and resupply. The area has extremely heavy bear activity during salmon season, which is completely expected and normal. Kodiak bears concentrate near salmon streams during spawning runs, feeding heavily and constantly to build the fat reserves they'll need to survive winter hibernation. I'd seen several large bears at a distance during my 3 days there, fishing in the stream about a quarter mile from my camp. They'd shown absolutely no interest in me, and I'd given them appropriate space and respect. I kept my camp scrupulously clean, stored all food and anything with scent in bear-proof containers, placed a safe distance away from my tent, and made deliberate noise when moving around the area to avoid accidentally surprising any bears. These are standard, non-negotiable bear country protocols that anyone working in these areas knows and follows religiously. On my 4th night there, I was woken around 2 a.m. by sounds directly outside my tent. Heavy breathing with a rhythmic quality, and the distinct sound of something very large moving around my immediate campsite, disturbing gravel and equipment. I assumed it was a bear investigating my camp, which does happen occasionally, even with proper precautions. Bears are curious and investigate anything unusual in their territory. I did what you're supposed to do. I made loud noise, yelling aggressively, and banging a metal pot with a spoon to scare the bear away. The sound stopped immediately. I waited in my tent, listening intently for several minutes. Complete silence. I started to relax, thinking the bear had moved away and the situation was resolved. Then something hit my tent hard. The entire structure shook violently, and one of the support poles partially collapsed inward, bringing part of the tent fabric down on top of me. I scrambled frantically out of my sleeping bag, grabbing both my bear spray canister and my headlamp, the 2 essential safety items. I unzipped the tent entrance quickly and shined my light outside, my finger on the bear spray trigger, ready to spray directly into the face of any bear that was right outside my tent. Nothing was there. The beach around my tent was completely empty in all directions as far as my headlamp could illuminate. My food containers were untouched and still secured exactly where I'd left them, 50 feet from the tent. No bear was visible anywhere in my light beam, but I could clearly see tracks in the sand around my tent, illuminated by my headlamp. They were definitely bear tracks, huge ones that indicated a very large male, probably weighing well over 1,000 pounds. But the pattern of the tracks was completely wrong and didn't make sense. Bear tracks when a bear walks normally show 4 paws in a characteristic pattern. These tracks showed only 2 feet, placed one directly in front of the other in a straight line, like something walking upright on its hind legs for an extended distance. Bears absolutely can and do stand on their hind legs temporarily to get a better view of something or to reach food, but they don't walk extended distances that way. It's biomechanically inefficient and uncomfortable for them given their body structure. They might take a few steps upright, but then drop back to all 4s. These tracks clearly showed that something had walked upright on hind legs around my entire camp, circling my tent multiple times. then approached the tent directly and struck it hard enough to collapse a pole, then walked away upright, back toward the tree line. The tracks continued in that bipedal pattern for as far as my light could reach. I was genuinely shaken, but tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe the tracks just appeared bipedal because of how the sand had shifted or been disturbed. Maybe I was misinterpreting what I was seeing in the limited light and in my frightened state. Maybe the bear had been mostly upright for some reason, and I was making too much of the track pattern. I did my best to repair the bent tent pole, got back inside, and tried to sleep with my bear spray held in my hand, ready to use instantly. Around 4 a.m., while I was lying awake and alert, it happened again. Something struck my tent from outside, this time with even more force, actually ripping a long tear in the waterproof fabric from top to bottom. I burst out of the tent immediately, my bear spray canister up and ready. And this time, I saw it clearly. About 40 feet away, standing motionless at the edge of the tree line where beach met forest, was something massive. It was standing completely upright on two legs, and it was over 8 feet tall. I'm certain of that. It was covered entirely in dark brown, shaggy fur. But the body shape and proportions were fundamentally wrong for a bear standing on its hind legs, which I've seen many times. The torso was too upright and vertical, too human-like in its proportions. The shoulders were too broad and square. The arms were far too long, hanging down past where the knees would be if it had knees like a human, and the head shape was wrong. The head was large and massive, but shaped wrong for a bear's head. The snout or muzzle was much shorter and flatter, more like a primate's face than a bear's characteristic elongated muzzle and nose. We stared directly at each other for what felt like an entire minute, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds in reality. It didn't move aggressively toward me. It didn't make any vocalizations or sounds. It just stood there, completely still, watching me intently with dark eyes that caught and reflected my headlamp light with a dull, reddish shine. Then it turned deliberately and walked away into the forest, not dropping to all fours like a bear naturally would, but remaining upright on two legs and walking away smoothly and naturally on those two legs, like bipedal walking was its normal, comfortable mode of movement. It moved with a fluid grace that seemed practiced and natural, not awkward like a bear forced to stand temporarily on hind legs. I didn't hesitate or try to rationalize further. I packed up my entire camp immediately in the dark, working frantically, loaded absolutely everything into my boat with no organization, and left that location. I motored 20 miles up the coast in darkness to a different fishing area where I knew there was a ranger station with people. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of that night, running on adrenaline and fear. When the ranger station opened in the morning, I reported everything I'd seen to Alaska Fish and game officials. They took detailed notes and were professional and polite, but I could tell clearly from their expressions and body language that they didn't believe my description of what I'd encountered. They said, almost dismissively, that I'd probably seen a large Kodiak bear standing upright and had misjudged its appearance and proportions in darkness and fear. They suggested the tracks probably were normal bear tracks that looked unusual because of sand conditions and lighting. They were polite, but fundamentally dismissive of my account. But I absolutely know what I saw. I've seen hundreds of Kodiak bears over 12 years of living and working on this island. I've seen bears standing on hind legs many times. I know exactly what a bear looks like in that position. This was fundamentally and obviously different. The proportions were wrong. The movement was wrong. The way it watched me with clear intelligence and curiosity was wrong. It showed behavior that suggested intelligence and deliberate decision-making, not the typical bear behavior of either fleeing when confronted or charging aggressively when threatened. After returning to town, I spent considerable time doing research. The Alutiiq people, the indigenous inhabitants of Kodiak Island for thousands of years before Russian and American contact, have extensive stories in their oral traditions about creatures they call hairy men, or wild men of the forest, who live in the most remote and inaccessible parts of the island. The descriptions in their traditional stories match closely what I encountered: large bipedal creatures covered in brown or reddish fur, showing human-like intelligence and awareness, usually avoiding humans, but occasionally making their presence known deliberately. The Alutiiq have always insisted that these are real physical beings that exist, not spirits or supernatural entities, and that they coexist with the bears in the island's vast wilderness areas. There have been other sightings reported over the years by credible witnesses: hunters, fishermen, hikers, all describing similar encounters with large bipedal creatures that don't match the description, behavior, or movement patterns of Kodiak bears standing temporarily on hind legs. Most people don't officially report their sightings because they don't want to face ridicule or be dismissed as crazy. But in private conversations, especially among people who spend extensive time in the island's backcountry areas, these stories circulate and are taken seriously. Kodiak Island is over 3,500 square miles of mostly roadless wilderness. The human population is less than 14,000 people, with the vast majority concentrated in Kodiak Town. Enormous areas of the island are rarely or never visited by humans. The terrain is extremely rugged, heavily forested in many areas, with mountains over 4,000 feet elevation. It's exactly the kind of place where large, intelligent animals could exist for generations completely undetected by scientific study, especially if they're intelligent enough to deliberately avoid contact with humans and have learned patterns of human activity. I still work as a commercial fisherman, and I still operate around Kodiak Island because it's my livelihood, and I genuinely love the work, but I'm significantly more careful now about where I camp alone in remote locations. I specifically avoid that particular area on the southwest coast where the encounter happened. And when I'm working in any remote location, I pay much closer attention to sounds in the forest, to unusual tracks on beaches, to the distinct feeling of being watched by something intelligent. The Kodiak brown bear is an apex predator, feared and respected by everyone who shares the island with them, and rightfully so. But I learned that night that bears aren't the only large, powerful, and potentially dangerous creatures living in Kodiak's vast wilderness. There's something else out there, something that walks upright, naturally and comfortably, something intelligent enough to circle a camp and study its occupant before deciding whether to reveal itself, something that has learned to coexist with both bears and humans by remaining mostly hidden and avoiding detection. Story 3. My name is David Chen. I'm 47 years old, and I work as a mining engineer specializing in evaluating old mining operations throughout Alaska. My job involves traveling to remote locations, often abandoned mining sites and ghost towns, to assess whether old mineral deposits might be worth reopening and reworking with modern extraction technology that's far more efficient than what was available decades or centuries ago. It's solitary work that frequently takes me to extremely remote locations, often ghost towns and abandoned settlements that haven't been occupied by living humans in decades. Last summer, I was hired by a mining company to evaluate several abandoned gold mining operations in the area around Nome, Alaska. Nome is historically famous for the massive gold rush of 1899, when tens of thousands of prospectors and fortune seekers flooded into the area following major gold discoveries on the beaches and in nearby creeks and rivers. Nome's population exploded virtually overnight, from essentially nothing to over 20,000 people, making it temporarily one of the largest cities in all of Alaska. Tent cities sprang up, saloons and businesses opened, and the whole region was consumed by gold fever. But like virtually all gold rushes throughout history, it didn't last long. By the 1920s, most of the easily accessible gold had been extracted, and the population declined dramatically as miners moved on to other opportunities. Nome remains a town of about 3,800 people today, but the surrounding area is absolutely dotted with abandoned mining camps and ghost settlements from the gold rush era, slowly deteriorating and being reclaimed by nature. One of the specific sites I was assigned to evaluate was a place called Solomon, an abandoned gold rush town located about 30 miles east of Nome along the coast. Solomon was originally established in 1900 at the height of the gold rush and had a peak population of approximately 1,000 people. It had stores, multiple saloons, a railroad connection, and extensive mining operations. But it was completely abandoned by 1950, when the last mining company pulled out, after the remaining gold deposits became uneconomical to work. Today, it's a genuine ghost town, just a scattered collection of collapsed buildings and rusting mining equipment slowly disappearing into the tundra. I drove out there in July in a rented four-wheel drive truck, planning to spend 3 full days systematically surveying the old mining sites, taking ore samples for assay, and documenting the remaining structures. The area is accessible by a rough dirt road during summer months, but it's completely isolated. The nearest occupied building of any kind is over 15 miles away. Cell phone service is completely non-existent. It's just you, the tundra, and the slowly collapsing buildings being reclaimed. I arrived in late afternoon and immediately set up a base camp near the remains of what historical records indicated had been Solomon's main street. Several buildings were still partially standing, though most were reduced to collections of weathered boards and collapsed roofs open to the sky. I spent the remaining daylight hours photographing and documenting everything, making detailed notes on the locations of the old mine shafts and processing equipment I'd need to examine. As the sun started to set, which in July at that latitude happens around midnight due to Alaska's extreme summer daylight hours, I set up my tent and prepared a simple dinner. The entire area was eerily quiet in a way that felt oppressive. No birds calling, no insects buzzing, just constant wind across the empty tundra. Abandoned places always have a certain atmosphere, but Solomon felt particularly heavy and oppressive, like the air itself was denser and heavier than it should be. Around 1 a.m., still in twilight because of the midnight sun phenomenon, I clearly heard music. Old piano music, ragtime style from the early 1900s, playing faintly but distinctly in the distance. I followed the sound, and it seemed to be coming from one of the more intact structures. What my historical research had suggested was the town's main saloon. I walked over with my flashlight, half expecting to find another researcher, or perhaps a radio or recording device someone had left behind as a prank. The building was completely empty, just a partially collapsed interior with holes in the walls and no roof remaining at all. No source for the music anywhere. But I could still hear it clearly, seeming to come from inside the ruins themselves. I searched carefully and thoroughly, thinking maybe there was some device hidden in the rubble or attached to the building somehow, but I found absolutely nothing. The music continued for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly and completely. I returned to my tent, deeply unsettled, but trying to rationalize it as sound carrying strangely across the flat tundra, maybe from a boat on the nearby coast, or even from Nome itself 30 miles away, though that seemed physically impossible. But the music had sounded close and clear, not distant and faint like sound traveling a long distance. That night, I had significant trouble sleeping. The tent felt claustrophobic and confining, and I kept hearing sounds outside that suggested activity and presence. Footsteps crunching on gravel, voices talking quietly in conversation, sounds that clearly suggested human activity in what should be a completely abandoned town. Around 3 a.m., I unzipped my tent and looked out carefully. The ruined buildings were exactly as they'd been when I went to sleep. No people, no vehicles, nothing that could explain the sounds I was hearing. But I saw lights. Small, flickering lights, like from oil lamps or candles, clearly visible through the empty window frames of several buildings. Moving lights, as if people were walking around inside the structures carrying lamps. I watched carefully for several minutes. The lights moved from building to building, sometimes multiple lights visible at once, sometimes disappearing entirely, then reappearing. But I could see clearly that the buildings were still complete ruins, still empty shells open to the sky. The lights existed and moved, but the structures they appeared to be in couldn't possibly support human occupation in their current state. I stayed in my tent, too unnerved to investigate further. The lights continued their movements for about an hour, then gradually disappeared as dawn approached and real daylight increased. I didn't sleep at all the rest of that night. The next day, I tried to work normally, collecting ore samples and documenting the mining sites as I'd been hired to do. But I was exhausted from lack of sleep and constantly distracted. Around noon, I heard voices clearly and distinctly. People talking, laughing, the unmistakable sounds of human activity and conversation. It sounded like it was coming from the main street area. I walked over quickly and saw nothing at all, just empty ruins and wind. But the voices continued, sometimes sounding very close, as if people were right next to me, sometimes more distant. I started packing up my equipment, planning to leave early, despite not completing my survey work. But my truck wouldn't start. The engine wouldn't even turn over. The battery seemed completely and totally dead, even though it had been working perfectly that morning. I spent over an hour troubleshooting, checking connections, trying everything I knew. Nothing worked. The truck was completely dead. I was stranded in an isolated ghost town 30 miles from the nearest help, with absolutely no cell service to call for assistance. I spent that second night genuinely terrified. The music started again around midnight, piano playing old songs from the Gold Rush era, and voices, many voices, talking and laughing loudly as if a saloon was in full operation with dozens of customers. And lights, dozens of moving lights throughout the ruined buildings. I could see shadows of people through empty window frames, moving and gesturing as if the buildings were intact and fully occupied by living people from over a century ago. Around 2 a.m., I saw someone standing directly near my tent. A man wearing old-fashioned clothes from the early 1900s, a long coat and wide-brimmed hat. He was completely solid, not transparent or ghostly in any way, looked completely real and physical. He stared directly at me for a long, uncomfortable moment, then turned and walked deliberately toward the saloon ruins. I watched him walk through the doorway of the ruined building and disappear inside, even though the building had no real interior anymore, just a pile of collapsed lumber and debris. I huddled in my tent until morning, not sleeping a single moment, just waiting desperately for dawn. When the sun rose and daylight returned, everything returned to silence. The lights were completely gone. The sounds stopped entirely. Even the oppressive feeling lifted slightly. That morning, my truck started immediately on the very first try, as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. I packed all my equipment as quickly as possible and drove back to Nome. I didn't complete my survey, didn't collect all the samples I'd been hired to get. I just left and didn't look back. I filed my report with the mining company based on the partial data I'd managed to collect, but I didn't mention any of the experiences in the ghosted town. I claimed equipment failure had shortened my time on site, but I made it absolutely clear, in my professional opinion, that I didn't recommend reopening any of those mining operations, citing various safety concerns and poor resource potential. My actual reason was that I never wanted to return to that place or encourage anyone else to go there. After returning to civilization, I spent considerable time researching Solomon's history in detail. The town had a very dark side during its brief years of operation. Violence was extremely common. Disputes over mining claims led to multiple murders. Several devastating fires destroyed large parts of the town, and dozens of miners died in accidents or from exposure during the brutal winters. The town cemetery, still visible near the ruins, holds hundreds of graves from its brief period of activity. All that suffering, death, desperation, and violence apparently soaked into the place itself. Alaska is full of ghost towns from various gold rushes and mineral booms throughout its history. Most are simply empty buildings, sad remnants of failed dreams and abandoned hopes, but otherwise harmless. But some places, certain abandoned settlements, seem to hold onto the past in ways that go far beyond physical structures remaining. The energy, the emotions, the traumatic events that happened there don't dissipate with time as you'd expect. Instead, they concentrate, crystallize, replay endlessly, and become something that can interact with and affect the living. I've evaluated dozens of abandoned mine sites throughout Alaska during my career. I'll continue to do this work because it's my profession and I'm genuinely good at it. But I will never return to Solomon under any circumstances. And I've learned to recognize the warning signs of places that should be left completely alone. The oppressive atmosphere that's immediately noticeable. The unexplained sounds that have no physical source. The overwhelming feeling that the past isn't really past, but still present, active, and aware.